Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. We're so grateful to have you. Welcome.
Hey, Jon.
Hey, everybody. This is Jon Sherwood. Welcome to the Unpolished podcast. In this episode, I have the great pleasure of inviting onto the call with me the other network pastors here for our local microchurch network, Mike and Ali Ailey, James and Danielle Hatfield, and my wife, Brittany Sherwood. And we just get to talk a little bit about the transition and the ways that we have traversed from a traditional church into this microchurch expression. We explore the highs, the lows. We have a lot of laughs. And we have a lot of memories. We walk down memory lane. We think about COVID. We think about how many rolls of toilet paper people were stockpiling and everything in between. Let's jump into it. So this obviously is our church network leadership, pastoral leadership, Mike and Ali Ailey, James and Daniela Hatfield, and my special, beautiful bride, Brittany Sherwood. And together we have been endeavoring on this microchurch sort of transition, expedition, experiment, wilderness in the lab gone wrong type thing for about 4 or 5 years. And tonight we're just going to be able to unpack and kind of talk through like what it is that we've experienced in this journey, the highs, the lows, the things that we look back on with great affection, and the things that we look back on and go, I would do that differently today, and what we're hoping for in the future. So let me start off by just asking, what is it for you that you remember most fondly as you look back on this transition over the last 4 or 5 years into microchurch networks? Go ahead and just jump in, feel free, whatever comes to mind.
The first thing that came to my mind about the whole transition, I think, is actually what we would call our MCP training. So our microchurch pastor training. And I think that was the first thing that came to mind, because while the whole church has gone through this transition, we work in a much tighter community with those microchurch pastors. And the whole church journeys and has journeyed together, but we've done, so much more with that pastor group. So that was the first thing that came to mind.
So what about the microchurch pastor group and their training and engaging more intimately with that group? What do you look back on and feel so fondly? Is it the relationships? Is it some component of how that group is integrated together? What specifically comes to your mind?
I think it starts just with the devotion of each individual microchurch pastor, their devotion to God, but then how we can come together and share in that. And so, and our training has, transitioned just like our microchurch, has transitioned. But we, as we've jumped into a various myriad of topics in the past 5 years as a church. And so I think being able to really study that out, even before we roll it out to the whole network, the work that we've all done individually, but then collectively to come to an agreement or an understanding about what God says about a certain topic or what we think about being called pastors. So I think it's that, but then also every year we take a microchurch pastor training retreat. And so that has been a really special time to retreat together with God, grow in our understanding of him, how we connect to with him, but then we get to do that all together, and it's very bonding.
Yeah. How many people thought about the microchurch pastor retreat each year as a part of something they look back on fondly? I know for sure that's one of mine.
I definitely did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how come?
I think, as Ali was just sharing, I think, first of all, the microchurch pastor retreat has the content, the experience, the relational bonding of the spirit during that time is unlike anything I've ever experienced before. And even how I understood ministry and retreats, I think has gotten redefined through that retreat in a lot of ways, in the sense that coming there, I really do feel ministered to, feel filled up, feel strengthened, feel incredibly connected to God and to the microchurch pastor leadership group. And it's such a vulnerable time, a tender time, a spiritually enriching time. And so many times in the past in ministry, it was at times more about just pouring out, instead of really getting strengthened. And then from that strengthening of the Spirit and of God, pouring out from that instead of my own abilities. So I think that's one of the things.
Yeah. And just to provide a little context here at this portion of the conversation, our microchurch pastor, what we call retreat, for the last 4 years has been primarily focused on classic spiritual formation. And so we bring in outside consultants who actually lead our retreat times each year, who are trained formation guides and retreat guides, trained spiritual directors through Dallas Willard camps and Renovare and things like this. And it has been so amazing and transformative. To say that it has been formational seems cliche and undersold, but it has really, I think, revolutionized so much for us personally, for us as a leadership team, for us as a microchurch pastor team, and I think for the whole ethos of the entire network, that it has been embedded deeply in the whole goalpost shifting from what are we even trying to accomplish at church? And it really has to do with being formed into the likeness of Jesus.
I mean, we even took it so far and been so impacted that now later this year, we're inviting a bunch of folks from around the country to come and join and experience it as a gift to them, to say, look, we've been given so much, we want to give this back so you can experience and take it back to your churches and experience it there as well. It's just been, we try all these different practices together, and you can't help but just be so impacted by it. That's we can't just keep this to ourselves.
Absolutely. What else do you look back on fondly over the last few years when you think about, where we've come from and where we are and kind of that whole process? What do you look back on fondly?
Sure. Allie mentioned obviously the people, and then leading to this retreat that we've kind of done with, the past several falls. But I was just kind of thinking of the group, the microchurch pastor group, MCPs as we call them. And it's a group of very common people. I myself am in that, we're just common day-to-day people trying to slow our lives down, trying to just experience God, and we may need to go away from the trying to produce, trying to be productive, trying to whatever, and instead just slow down and experience God. And so I was actually thinking of the people, just the relationships, perhaps outside of the blood of Jesus, that we may not have a lot in common with these people, but just how we've really tried to intentionally live lives with him. And I think that's, obviously it takes several years, it takes time to build these relationships, but I think God's doing something there.
So y'all have all these deep thoughts.
Okay, hit us with the non-deep thought, Daniela. That's why you came, girl. Come on, play your position.
So when you asked the question, the very first thing that popped in my head was...
Wait for it.
So we launched microchurches right before COVID.
January 2020, baby.
Yeah, it's crazy. So we were meeting on video calls a lot. And I remember this one particular call where we had...
Yes.
Was it a competition or everyone had, it was during the toilet paper shortage of 2020.
I totally forgot about this.
Everyone had to go gather every roll of toilet paper they had in their house and stack it up in front of their camera. And I just remember this one single gal, she lived all by herself. She must have had 60 rolls of toilet paper.
Higher. It was over 100.
And we were just laughing our heads off and trying to make the best of crazy times. But I have so many silly little memories like that. And,
please do share. Do share. Come
on.
At least one more.
I think was the icebreaker when we would do something before, we jump in. We're all trying to figure out what church looks like on a screen. And so, I forget, we had shoot a Halloween party, I think at one point, best dress costume or something, perhaps. Yeah. I'm trying to think some of the other icebreakers. You remember?
Yeah, COVID was a crazy time for everybody, obviously trying to figure out how to live in community in Jesus while we need to be, either shut into our homes or 6 feet away from each other. That was a trying and difficult challenge for anyone in the world at that time. And so we certainly had our hiccups as we were just launching, thinking, yeah, we're going into a new year, a new decade, micro churches, wah, wah, wah. And so that really put us on hiatus, and we kind of were just like doing what everyone else was doing, trying to piecemeal it together, doing digital, doing physical. We did phygital for a while where everybody was kind of like half and half. And then eventually we ended up, kind of relaunching into micro churches. And it had been a good like 8, 9, 12, 14 months before we were all really back together. And it felt like we had to kind of push the reset button and start over again. And so for me, I remember feeling so frustrated of like, man, we put in all this preparatory work for like 2 years to get ready to hard launch. And like, it just felt like it got blown up. And so maybe you guys can talk about that. Like, what do you remember? And then I remember everyone would come back to us, right? Once everything started opening back up and being like, oh man, you guys are so smart. You're in little house churches, and look, the pandemic, see, like we all should have been doing that. And we had a Zoom account long before COVID ever hit. And they're like, you're so wise, and we're like, well, actually it didn't really help a whole lot, but sure. Okay. Thanks. Maybe you guys can share some stories that you remember of that particular period of time during the lockdown and the pandemic, and how that impacted, what you recall of our transitioning into micro churches or lack thereof.
Yeah, I actually had the same thought when COVID hit and we had just started micro churches. I thought, we are so well positioned for this. What great timing. We're going to be awesome at this. And it was a lot harder than any of us expected, I think. But one thing I do remember, and I don't know if it was the microchurch that contributed to this or if it was just wanting to stay connected to people, but I think for a couple of years, I had a very sort of thriving prayer phone call exchange with a bunch of different people. I mean, every week, multiple different people. I had appointments to pray on the phone, and I don't do that anymore very much. And so I think that was special to that time for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, I look back fondly thinking of the pandemic. I say hard launch, but for the audience that might not be familiar, for us, January 2020, our hard launch meant that we were gathering in micro churches one Sunday per month. So it was brand new to us, and we were not well positioned for the pandemic in that regard, like you said, Daniela. But you know what? 4 years later, what we were way more well positioned for in our micro churches is when Helene hit, when we were devastated in these Western Carolina mountains by Hurricane Helene. And you're wearing one of our swag hoodies, Daniela, if you want to prop that up. Yeah, WNC Strong, one of our microchurch members actually drew that, and we raised funds around the hoodie. And it was like so different seeing from 2020 and the pandemic to how, because in some ways the hurricane was even crazier. Like communications were shut off. There was no internet. There was no cell phone signal for days and weeks. Most of this area didn't have clean drinking water for 7 or 8 weeks. And to see, once we were actually practiced at and really integrated and had the time to bake into this microchurch expression, I know my wife and I, we saw things come together and people care for one another and love each other and love their neighbors as we did so many people in the community, right? But it was so amazing to see that fruit really bud on the vine when the circumstances really necessitated it, right? And so it's interesting as I think back to COVID and how really we were at a place where our microchurch expression really didn't make any difference for us, because we were still essentially a traditional church, like starting to dip our toe in the water. But fast forward 4 years, and it was a completely different experience. And I remember being off the grid and I was one of the last people in the network to be accounted for, because we had no power, no signal up here for a while. And I remember once I did finally get back on the grid, like 4, 5, 6, 7 days later, to hear all the stories of how the micro churches were just so taking care of each other, sharing resources, helping their neighbors. It was just like Acts 2 in 42 and following just was being lived out in front of my face. And I think we were so proud and so grateful and just so excited to see, I think, what we had always like hoped and believed we would see, but you don't know until that fire of testing comes.
Sure.
So maybe you guys can talk about that for a little bit. Like, what kind of fire and testing have you seen through this process? You know, what have been some of the hurdles, the challenges? What are some of the things you might look back on over the last 4 years and go, we probably would do that different today?
I think the extra long pause is because we're still figuring it out. Right? Like, kind of like looking back, woulda, coulda, shoulda. Give me another 4 years, you know, like, and then maybe I might be wise enough to tell you where we're messing it up, because we're just so, cliche word, unpolished when it comes to what we're doing, right? And so we're still figuring out what the face palm slapped to the head is like, oh, shouldn't have done that, you know? I mean, what it should have, could for me is I wish we could have gone faster, but in hindsight, I'm glad we didn't. Meaning going from like 1 Sunday a month to 2 to 3, we were nice and slow there. But now that we're in it, like, I tend to prefer the small micro church gathering over the larger macro network church gathering, because one of the things that I love so much about this expression is that the 80-20 rule gets flipped on its head. So in the macro church, 20% of the people are doing all the work. And the micro church expression, I find that 80% of the people are doing the work. I hear a medley more of voices. I get to know brothers and sisters way more. We, as pastors, work hard to draw out the entire micro church with whatever we're doing, including the kids and hearing the kids' voices. So I think we've continuing to learn, and we'll let you know. But I don't know if we've got it all figured out yet.
Yeah, I know for me, I think one thing, James, I know you and I have talked a lot about, and this team has talked a lot about, is with that microchurch pastor group, we took a year before the hard launch and a soft launch year where we kind of stuck our toe in meeting in microchurches a handful of times. And we pulled a group aside to start working with them to potentially lead their own microchurch. And at that stage, everything was so new. We were just kind of tapping people on the shoulder saying, hey, would you be interested in this? Would you do this? And that sort of model for identifying leaders really trailed with us for some time, where, we started seeing these microchurches grow, and we needed these microchurches to continue to multiply and divide in order to remain micro. We had a joke running for a while that there were several micro churches that really weren't micro churches. They were just more macro churches. And one of the things that I think I look back on and go, we did tap shoulders, and sometimes that went really well in the long run. And I think people really were able to embrace that calling. But there are also, I think, probably more times than not that it really didn't go well. And I think what I learned, and I think what we learned, is that desire, that ability to really pastor and shepherd a microchurch, I think must be ultimately a calling from the Lord, and not just a calling from a leader to say, hey, can you step in the gap? Now, there are times where I think people need to step in the gap and maybe do something for a season, but I'm talking about long term. To be able to sustain, it's got to be something that you feel called from the Lord about. And I think that's something we've been wrestling with and trying to figure out as it relates to even micro churches multiplying and springing up and new ones beginning. Is it really being funneled and motivated and fueled by the Spirit of God in people's hearts, rather than our strategy or trying to add +2 and divide by 1 and carry the 0? Like, it just doesn't work, and I think our strategies have fallen on their faces more often than not, where we see God's Spirit at work. I think that's where we're starting to learn how to get better at discerning, listening, and then joining God there in that work. Maybe some of you guys could talk about that for a minute, and what you've seen in your own life and in this microchurch pastor training leadership type group that we're so connected to.
There's been almost like a revolving door of people that either have been tapped or I don't know. And sometimes as we're reflecting, as that like door keeps revolving, we have to kind of go back and be like, wait, what was the motivation? Because we have, I don't know, fallen into, like you said, just that same strategy over and over. And it has always gone, I don't know if smooth is the right word, but when there is that internal motivation, it does seem just to carry them. Like they're ready to serve. They want to serve. And not that people that have come into the microchurch pastors training because we asked them to, like, that they didn't want to, but it's, and each person was probably different, but as they went through the training, like rubber met the road somewhere, whereas like, I don't know if this is really my calling, or I don't know if anyone really said that, but it'd be like, I can't do this anymore, or, I'm going to step out, or yeah.
Yeah, I think in this situation, I keep on thinking of Isaiah 55, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways. And you could put it to anything we've done in this whole process. I think we try certain strategies and then God reveals a whole different path and a different approach than I know I would have ever sculpted out or thought would work. And I think specifically with that revolving door and that tension between tapping shoulders or like really trying to inspire or help somebody think we know they're calling for them versus the one that's intrinsically in them. This one conversation with one of our microchurch pastors, because every once in a while we'll check in and be like, okay, are you still really wanting to do this? Is this something that's on your heart? Like, we don't want people to burn out. That's not our hope or our desire. So we'll check in with people. And there was one particular microchurch pastor that we were like, is this really the right seat on the bus for this person? And we had a conversation with them. And as much as we kept on trying to ask, they were like, no, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do. I am not going to like get kicked out of this.
You're going to have to fire me.
You're going to have to fire me. And it was so funny because I remember that conversation and looking back at that conversation and who they are now. Mm-hmm. I think it was God showing us, okay, one, your time is not my time. Your thoughts are not my thoughts, but also like give a little time, for this person. And they've changed. There's so much that they've grown into that role and really have embraced that role as a microchurch pastor. And that's been one of my joys of even looking at the past 4 years, is seeing some of these microchurch pastors who were tentative or even not who you would readily have said God's calling you to come into this role, but really find their place and use their gifts. And I think some of that goes back to also how us reconstructing how we're defining a microchurch pastor leader as well.
Right.
So it's just an interesting thought as I've been considering just the past couple of years with this group.
So what have we left behind? Like James, you mentioned earlier that you prefer, going to the microchurch expression rather than even the network expression where we all get together for traditional service once a month currently. Like, as you guys think about some of the things that we've kind of left behind and that we don't really do or participate in anymore, things that aren't really a part of our expressions as churches or microchurches anymore, what are some things that you think about that we've left behind? And what do you like about them being left behind, and why? Just talk about that for a minute.
We've left behind the age, stage type of demographic, right? Where the kids go to the kids class, the teens get the teen room, the marrieds are here, the singles are there. And, it's like an old middle school dance where everyone's on their own wall. You know what I mean? Like that is
like
what
an
we left
octagon.
behind. Yeah, it's an octagon. Yeah, you got everybody, all the different groups. But I think leaving that behind has opened up, like when you're in your micro church, you've got all the ages, all the stages, everybody's in there together. And when you hear from somebody that has a little more gray hair on their head compared to someone who might be 13 or 14 years old, you're hearing all those medley of voices. And I think it's just that much more dynamic. and it's really nice. It's really good. You know, at first it's a little bit like, oh, okay, we got the kids right there on the floor. Like, we want to talk about this now. But no, it does work really
Yeah,
well.
or you've got the, you know, the brother or sister who doesn't really know anything about voice order, and they're just bloviating for like 20 straight minutes, and you're like, okay, you know, like, give some room for someone else to talk. And to me, I think it creates this richness of actually having to love people that are different than us, much more so than maybe other types of environments and ecosystems where like humans tend to gravitate towards humans that are like them. Right. And that's why the middle school dance phenomenon happens for middle schoolers and for adults of every stripe and age and color and economic background. And so I think these micro churches, for me, do kind of put like a magnifying glass and kind of a spotlight on, okay, Jon, like, are you going to love other people that are not like you? Or maybe people who, you know, kind of like rub you the wrong way or kind of irk you or have some idiosyncrasies that you don't like. And then I have to remember, oh yeah, that's how everyone feels about me every single day. And, you know, it's just a beautiful thing. So what have we left behind, and what do you like about it and why?
I think
Well, I
we've
guess-
left behind.
Good.
Okay, sorry. I think we've left behind the sort of Sunday structure for the most part. It was our goal to leave it behind, but in our church context, usually Sundays were super predictable, right? Okay, we're going to sing 2 or 3 songs, then someone's going to get up and welcome everybody, and then we might sing a song, and then we'll have communion, and then it was just kind of, you know,
same order every
cut
time.
and paste, same order. Yeah. And there was a reason for that. And I'm not saying that's even a bad thing. We still pretty much do that when we do come together as a network, and that's fine. But I think as we've had some years now to start stretching our wings a little bit, I think the Holy Spirit is leading us into more creativity of what our times together could be and what he might want to do with them. And it's been really freeing. And I feel like we're still just getting started in terms of exploring what we could do with God as microchurches.
Yeah, I was going to say something really similar, like to the name of our podcast, Unpolished. Like, we've left something that even, like, it's been a goal as a network for it not to just be this show, you know, like, we're trying to engage people as best as we can in that setting. But you come into microchurch and it is unpolished, and often, you know, you're giving space for the Spirit to move. And like James in our microchurch has started, like, after we sing each song, just to give space for the Spirit to process and then talk about, like, how are you connecting with God right now? What emotions are you feeling? What memories tie into how we're worshiping God right now? And it is so different than it. So, like, I enjoy being able to worship collectively, like as a network, to be able to sing all together. But there is something that it's unpolished, and it may not even sound, you know, like the best, but there is something very worshipful about the way that we can do that together. And it is so vulnerable. And I think that's been something that's beautiful that's come out of microchurch. I think at the beginning, people are like, oh, I don't know how to act. Or is it okay for me to, like, let down my guard and just start crying when I'm worshiping in this really small, you know, group of people in someone's living room? But just the emotional intimacy that gets brought along with what Daniela was saying, like getting away from something that's kind of scheduled and, you know, into messy a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think structure is not a bad thing.
Right.
Like, my children need structure in their lives, you know, or it's going to get real messy, you know. I need structure. We all need structure. So, like, it's not inherently wrong. And obviously we've talked about different ways of doing things, but, like, obviously traditional church, several songs, announcements, you know, plug and play, like, that has nice, neat structure. And so I think I was just connecting a few of these questions, like the hurdle question, like, at the beginning, it's almost like you're losing control, and not like a bad thing, like I'm controlling people or, but in some ways, we do actually try and control God in a lot of ways. And we won't even go down that rabbit hole because that could be its own podcast, but I think we all struggle with control in a lot of ways. But in the microchurch standpoint, well, if you're fighting that, that's going to get real messy real quick, So I think in some ways the initial hurdle was like, ooh, I don't know. What if somebody starts speaking in tongues? We don't know, it was just like hypothetical. What if? We don't know. And obviously, there's teaching and stuff like that about speaking in tongues. But I think it seemed like a hurdle, but then it's almost like we've embraced the hurdle. We appreciate what's actually being brought to allow us to have crucial conversations. Well, how are things going? Okay, yeah, it's not just about this random song, but what is it about it? How is God teaching you in this moment? And so I just think that's the walking with people and trying to partner with God, kind of connecting control, I guess.
Yeah, I know for me, that control element is so tied to my job description historically and traditionally, right? Is that where does that structure come from? Where does that order come from in a traditional church service? Well, you typically pay clergy essentially to do that. And for me, I think the main thing that we've left behind is the spectator sport that traditional church can so often and unintendedly create, right, for people. And so when you walk into a microchurch and it's not just a traditional big church shrunk into a living room, right, where there's 3 songs and announcements and a sermon, it is really this communal experience with God that is often unpredictable. We've been talking about prayer in our microchurches. We've been studying prayer and we've been led into deeper prayer practices and through, some of John Mark Comer's Practicing the Way stuff. And for many people, some of these practices are brand new, right? Even listening to God, trying to practice listening to God. You could walk into a microchurch and see people practicing trying to hear from God together. That could freak some people out, because what happens if somebody says, oh, I heard the voice of God. This is what it told me, and you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And it does create this sense of what's going to happen. And, there's a very small minority of people that are like, oh, that's awesome. Sign me up. I can't wait, but most people are like, dude, that's crazy. And that's scary and that's vulnerable. And I don't know if I'm ready for that. Go put me back in my movie theater spectator seat, please. And so let's talk about that for just a quick minute as we bring this plane in for a landing, as we think about trying to leave behind the spectator sport that Christianity so often is for so many. What are you hoping for in the future as you think about people being invited into this participatory experience and walk with Jesus through our microchurch network?
John, I think you were the one that mentioned voice order maybe earlier. So that's something that we've, introduced to our microchurches. And so voice order is for those that typically wouldn't speak up, that they're encouraged to say something. And then maybe those that are easy to jump up, share, like you said, maybe take 20 minutes of sharing versus, staying back and allowing those that don't speak. So I think that's something that started to happen, but I think that's one of my hopes is that as people really embrace and participate in the microchurch, that voice order really becomes a balanced effort, maybe is the way to say that.
Yeah, and just for the audience, because most people probably have not heard voice order or heard that terminology. Voice order is ultimately asking for everyone to deny themselves. And if your denying of yourself means that you need to speak up when you would rather not, then that's what it means. And if denying yourself means to sit back and to be quiet when you would rather not, then that's what it means. And that in doing so, in all of us denying ourselves, we have a more rich communal experience of each other. So just to kind of elaborate a bit more
Yeah.
for people that might not be familiar with that. And, that has been just one of those small little things that I think has just leavened the entire network and has made such a difference in these participatory environments. So just to explain that further, sorry to cut you off there, Allie. What else were you going to say there?
No, I think I agree with what you just said. To be able to see, it's almost like I said, a level playing ground of everyone participating. Because sure, you can still show up to micro church and be like, no, thank you, but where those that we typically don't hear, they're becoming more and more comfortable being the first one to speak. And I think you had mentioned this in a podcast recently of just the beauty of being able to hear the voices that you probably never would have had an opportunity to hear. And so yeah, just to, I think my hope, my dream, or, just to see that continue and just the growth of individuals, but then the whole community as that continues to happen.
Yeah.
Mine is quick. What I hope to see is we're in a lot of neighborhoods now and meeting houses. I want to see more and more people being able to walk to church.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
How is that going to happen, James? What do you think? Like, what's some of your prayers, some of your instincts? Are you hearing anything from God that might give you some sort of thought process on, how something like that might happen?
Well, it took a hurricane for it to happen in our neighborhood. Everybody in our neighborhood walked to our driveway, and I knew it was going to happen one time. But everybody there was impacted on a deep level. Everybody walked to church that day. So I've seen it once, and maybe that's all I'll ever get to see. And maybe that's what I'm longing for, but I hope it doesn't take another huge hurricane to make that happen. And, but it is, having experienced it, it was something that I consider maybe a peak of my journey with Jesus.
That's awesome. Yeah. And as we're kind of landing the plane here on this discussion, I appreciate all you guys joining us, but I'm thinking about how, I believe it's C.S. Lewis who said that God whispers to us in our joys and he shouts at us in our pain. And how through our pain and suffering, our eyes tend to get lifted to God because we are so acutely aware of our need. And I think that's what you were saying there in the wake of the hurricane and so much devastation. People look to God, and what a beautiful thing if we can do that, even in the midst of our joys, right? Even in the midst of life being completely normal and clean water coming out of the faucet and electricity running through the lines, and yet we can still look our eyes to the hills where our help come from. Thank you guys so much again for being here on the Unpolished podcast. We'll see you in the next episode.